Good afternoon, and welcome everybody to Building the Black Educator Pipeline Podcast. I am your host, Shana Terrell. I am Director of Pipeline Programming at the Center for Black Educator Development. I am an educator activist committed to being a change agent out here in the world, y'all. And of course, I appreciate all of you watching, all of my co-conspirators, all of our supporters for coming back every week and supporting us. I have to give a major shout out, as always, to my birthplace, South Bronx, that raised me. But of course, an even greater shout out to Philadelphia, who made me. So shout out. This is our 10th show. So once again, I am so excited, and we appreciate all of the love and support. And shout out, as always, to Citizens Ed for making it possible for us to have this platform to talk to real people out there doing real work and having a real impact on education. So today's show, we really want to talk about, our theme will be benefits of Black educators on classroom culture. But we're going to be honing in on a very specific topic today. And that topic will be understanding the impact of social justice in the classroom. So a question that I have out there for all my co-conspirators watching is, what does social justice in the classroom look like to you? So if you could please comment, of course, like and share this video. But to start us off, comment, what does social justice in the classroom look like to you? So I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to today's guest. We are welcoming back Dr. Greg Carr to the show, and I'm so excited that he is going to be joining us. So for those of you who don't know, Dr. Carr is an expert on legacy of Black education and the co-founder of the Philadelphia Freedom Schools movement. Dr. Carr currently serves as the Associate Professor of Afro-American Studies, an adjunct at Howard Law, and a Department Chair of African Studies at Howard University. Dr. Carr led the creation of African American history curriculum now required by all Philadelphia youth within the public school system. He also served as the city's first resident scholar of race and culture in 1999. Dr. Carr has dedicated his career to Black history and education through scholarly work, lecturing around the world, and media features which include BBC, NPR, and CNN. He's also the co-host of his own YouTube series called In Class with Carr, which highlights every Saturday at 12. Dr. Carr, I'll let you get more information on that broadcast just to plug you. But please welcome to the show, Dr. Greg Carr, my Baba and my mentor. Welcome, Dr. Carr.
With great pleasure. I'm so glad to be here with you, Sister Shana, as always. What are we now? Is this the second or third month? Third month, huh?
It's the third month. This is the 10th show. You were our very first guest.
Oh, 10. That's a good number. That's a good number. That's my number when I played center field at Hillsborough High School. Also my line number. So 10 is a good number.
So the stars are aligning. This means that this is right. This means that this is
question. Shout out to Noor and to Josh and the people that focus Citizen Ed, and of course, Ashray and Nadira and Sister Erica and Baba El Mekki and all the folks at the center doing this work. Y'all spread the word. We're gonna have a hell of a conversation today.
Yes, I'm ready for today. So this is one of those conversations where, of course, I have a structured outline, but because these conversations are so deep, I mean, where the wind takes us, it will take us today.
No question. No question.
So what I want to start off with, right? And this is a hefty question, but I think you could be one to answer this. What is social justice, right? So before we even start talking about social justice in the classroom, given all the things that are going on in today's climate, what is social justice?
I think social justice is the work of building better community, if we just keep it very simple. And what does that mean? Now, what that means is going to be very specific depending on where you are in human history, time, and space. One summer, several years ago, I know in Freedom Schools there in Philly, we read Ayikwe Arma's book, The Way of the Companions. And at the center of that book is that human beings working in community can literally transform not only their lives and experiences as human beings, but they can align those lives and experiences with the larger world we live in, the ecosystem, whether it be the environment, whether it be the built environment or the natural environment. The fact that we're doing this right now online is as a consequence of the fact that human beings pushed against nature, and nature pushed back in the form of the latest coronavirus, COVID-19. And so I think social justice really is about building better community. And when you apply that broad effort to very specific circumstances, social justice means that one human being does not kill another human being through execution by putting his knee on his neck for nearly 9 minutes. Social justice does not mean after that death occurs, then the context changes. Social justice looks like this person must be punished and this system must be remade. You can't bring that person back. So I don't say, when people say justice for George Floyd or justice for Breonna Taylor, can you bring them back to life?
Justice would have been them not being killed in the first place.
Justice would have been them not being killed in the first place. So yeah, so that's right. Social justice means building better community, and what that means is it has to be different contexts require different answers to that broad concept of how you build better community.
Definitely. So when we take that concept and apply it to education, what would social justice look like inside of a classroom?
Ooh, my dear, I have been blessed to be alive and on this planet, and for the vast majority of my adult life, on the road to learning every day how better to answer that question. I don't have a clear answer in terms of an outcome, but the more I've learned from master teachers, so many of them there in the city of Philadelphia, and so many of them now ancestors, and the more I've learned in community, particularly through Freedom Schools and now through the work with the center, being in community with fellow educators like you, with young people, and the more I've learned in trying to put the lessons I've learned in those communities to work in community with young people, I guess it really looks like helping us regain what I refer to increasingly these days. I don't know when I said it first or where it came from in terms of where it fixed in my mind, but it's been there now. Really trying to apply the momentum of memory. The momentum of memory. And what do I mean by that? I'll make a very specific example. There in Philadelphia, there was an organization, there was an institution that we've talked about before, called the Institute for Colored Youth, that was started in South Philadelphia in the mid 19th century. Black folk, black teachers, subsidized and helped by white allies, and they set the highest standard based on what they knew to be the highest standard in education of the time, and they required black children to meet that standard, and they did. Fannie Jackson Coppin, Octavius Catto, so many very important educators. And the momentum, of course, parenthetically, that institution still exists in a different form. It morphed over the decades and eventually became what we now know as Cheney University. So Cheney University, which was the place for many years, which trained the majority of black school teachers in Philadelphia. Very important to understand that. The momentum of memory means when we try to answer the question of what does allyship look like? What should we be teaching black children and all children? What should we be learning? What should a teacher be equipped with? The momentum of memory means we go back into our memory and look for best practices, what worked, what didn't work, and then find out in the living now, how can we adjust those practices to apply to different sets of circumstances and extend and add those different techniques.
Baba, that sounds like Sankofa to me.
Well, that's exactly what it is. In fact, I'm very proud of the fact that Sister Njamele and so many others came together. This is now nearing closer to 20 years ago now, to create, when we created the Pathways curriculum in Philadelphia Freedom Schools. And echoes of that, Sister Kelly and others are still in practice at Sankofa Freedom Academy there in the city. We had 4 pathways. And we called it the Pathways curriculum because we felt like the value of curriculum is when educators get together, thinking very deeply, coming from their content areas, and then contribute their experiences to shaping a method of teaching and learning, which is very effective in the classroom and making it flexible enough to adjust. But that requires creating frameworks And those frameworks then become the kind of guideposts we can use to keep that momentum going. And that pathways curriculum had a pathway to Sachet, which was a pathway to things that could be counted and measured and observed in the quantitative world, math and other things, a pathway to Jehudi, which was a pathway to reading and writing. And we'll talk about all these things as it applies to social justice in a second. A Sankofa rewind, which is what you just said, going back to return forward, to go forward, this momentum of memory. And then we had a pathway to Ma'at. Ma'at was our pathway that was deliberately targeted to, in the words of the great, another adopted Philadelphian there, our sister, the elder, Sonia Sanchez, who often in a play she wrote back in the 60s says, but how do it free us? So that pathway to Ma'at is that social justice. Okay, all this is good. Now, how does it free us? So going back into the momentum of memory then allows us to understand that we have been here before, even as we have not been here before. So when George Floyd is killed, when Breonna Taylor is killed, and they just charged these three cats, Travis McMichael, Gregory McMichael, and William Bryan Jr. in Georgia, faced federal charges for killing Ahmaud Arbery last year. So all those things, we say, instead of saying, wow, what do we do? What should we make sense of this? What do y'all think? Who should we, what should we pause, take a breath, and engage in the Sankofa rewind, because Octavius Catto, for whom there's a statue at City Hall, was Ahmaud Arbery. When those white boys killed him when he was going out on the way to vote in the 19th century. So, what did we learn from that? What did we learn from that? And what did we not learn that we can apply? So that momentum of memory in the classroom does two things. And I'll end with this. One thing it does, it allows us to see what has changed and what hasn't. And the other thing that it does, it doesn't begin our conversations and our learning with the trauma. Because see, when you start with the trauma, you have made it very difficult to move away from the trauma. The trauma has become the framework. And that's something we work very hard to displace, because of people born out of trauma will just continue to experience serial trauma, because trauma becomes the normative anchor of their lives. And that's what we know how to survive. That's it. Survival becomes the goal of life. It's a tragedy. Yeah.
Because that's what you were born in. And right. And like I talk about this all the time with kids and being an educator and working in a school, and you see how certain students respond to things. Yes. Like everything was going great and she just snapped out. Because she has existed in the world where like this is actually too calm for me. Oh my I am goodness. My best self when things are chaotic.
But or she thinks she's her best self. That's right.
Yes, she thinks, right? That's the only way she knows how to like interact, survive, respond, communicate, right? And what's funny about what you're saying is like, I'm talking about an individual, but how impactful that can be systematically on a people. Yes. Right? We don't know how to move. We don't know how to organize unless somebody out here getting shot or getting killed. Yes. And a lot of that has to do with memory, right? Like this is not the first time this has happened. This has happened to us over a span of time in history. But if you're not educated properly, or these things aren't contextualized appropriately in the classroom, you would be thinking like, again, this is a whole new world of chaos. That's when we already have examples of this happening. And we already have examples of how we should respond. So another thing I think would be great for you to get into is like, what are some examples of the past that show us the benefits of social justice in the classroom? Because there were brothers and sisters back in the day who were implementing a social justice framework or pedagogy in the classroom, and showed what was birthed out of that.
Absolutely.
Can you give some examples of that?
I love it. Since and those of you for whom this is your first time, please come back on a weekly basis and hang out with Sister Shana on Thursdays, because this is the conversation that frees us. This helps us reset and rethink. So I know we have less than an hour now, so I'll give some very quick examples. And since this is being recorded and live streamed, y'all can go to the Facebook page, the YouTube channel, and watch this as your leisure. So let's go very quickly. A book we've read a couple of times now in Freedom Schools, W.E.B. Du Bois's The Education of Black People. He gave talks at all these HBCUs, some of them commencement speeches. He talked to educators like at Johnson C. Smith in North Carolina University. And in one of the speeches, he says, I once saw a perfect system of education. I was in West Africa and I saw these young people in a circle with their teacher, and they were out of doors near a tree, and they were basically engaged in the process of learning for life. Let's start with that as the central idea, that the purpose of education. Let's go back thousands of years, even before that, to the ancient Egyptians. Ptahhotep, in the book of Ptahhotep, which is a writing, an educational textbook. It's one of the textbooks they used to learn how to teach children how to read and write. It says, may I be instructed to make of the next generation a medu yawu. That means a staff of old age. That means, may I be instructed now as a teacher to train my replacement. The purpose of education is to extend the species, is to train your replacement. So you're not extending by sending them, okay, this is crisis management, this is crisis management, this is crisis management. No, this is existence. This is how you be in the world. And these are the things that will help us all be in the world, not just you as an individual, but us as a community. So coming forward past Du Bois, now we look at our experience here. The trauma of the last 500 years, this trauma of settler colonialism and enslavement and land dispossession and serial violence has created a situation where, if we don't pause and look at those moments in education where we have seized control of the education of our children and created those islands, those spaces, those free spaces, those maroon spaces, if you will, that will allow us to extend this notion of being in the world, and then look around us and say, what is stopping us from being in the world? We will lose the momentum of memory. So I can do this in about 60 seconds. So you see those first attempts to do it, those first creations to do it in those maroon spaces. Runaways who run away from the Spanish as early as the 16th century, before there's a so-called 1619 project. What are they doing out there? They're learning how to be in the world and learning how to keep that freedom. You come into the 18th century, 19th century, you see an education system that's informal, we would call it perhaps, take place in places like Haiti. The Haitian Revolution is absolutely built on people sending into their children and to each other the education they had taken from Africa and that they couldn't have beat out of them. The organizational logic is cultural, whether it be Vodun, whether it be these forms of being in the world, and they use that to resist enslavement, and they create an independent republic. If you look in the United States, closer to where we're having this conversation right now, you see organized attempts at education. You see the New York African Free School in the early 19th century. This is the school in New York where they say, what is the best that we can teach and learn and give to our children? It produces James McCune Smith, the doctor. It produces Ira Aldrich, the great the great actor. It produces Alexander Crummell and others. They are taking that, and these become leaders in the 19th century. And you see efforts like that pop up all around the United States. A lot of times they're tied to the churches. So the AME Church, for example, creates universities, whether it be Wilberforce University, Coppin, now Coppin State University, named for Levi Coppin. What you see is we create these spaces where we're teaching our children how to be in the world. And I'll end with this, because we could talk about a whole lot that has happened since then. I'll focus on something we all have heard of and perhaps studied, the civil rights movement.
Right.
The irony, and I tell students this all the time, and then I don't just tell them, we begin to read and study ourselves, and they see how interesting is it that the army of Black girls and boys, women and men that killed legal apartheid in this country came out of quote unquote segregated Black institutions. So people say, well, integration was their goal. No, their goal was how to be in the world and how to learn how to be in the world. Do not get caught up in integration and segregation. That's a narrative that's being imposed from outside. Yes, they wanted to end legal apartheid, but they came out of Selma High School, which was all Black. They came out of like Martin Luther King Morehouse College, that was all Black. They came out of like Ella Baker Shaw University, which was all Black. And out of these Black institutions, the question becomes, what were y'all learning that you then turned around and said, this society will now be remade so that we can all be in the world? You were learning the standard of education and the requirement that students be excellent, that we all advance. This isn't about show-stopping individuals. This is about communities advancing. And they were heroic teachers, and they were heroic students and families and communities. All of that becomes the fuel for the momentum of memory, so that in 2021 and beyond, we can say, instead of just experimenting with our children, well, I think this will work. I think this will work. Slow down, Sankofa rewind. What was
Yes.
Septima Clark doing in South Carolina in those literacy schools? What was Rosa Parks doing as she got her education and then came up and joined with Septima Clark, joined with Ella Baker, and turned that into the face of the civil rights movement? What did Benjamin Mays and Howard Thurman and them teach Martin Luther King when he was 16 years old, when he went to Morehouse with not the best grades, his C+ average out of high school? In other words, so stop imagining without remembering. If you imagine without remembering, you're just gonna keep being a figment of somebody else's education, and they'll have you out there trying to become a blackface version of somebody else's memories, and that will not get you free.
It won't get you free. It won't get you free at all. And again, the points that you're making, I think, are phenomenal. And I feel like people miss these points, especially the point that you made about the goal was never integration. So what America has done to the civil rights movement, Brown versus Board of Education, and Martin Luther King, right? Like whitewashed it in a sense. So even when schools are thinking that they're doing social justice because they're lifting up Martin Luther King, the entire context from that conversation is completely missed, right? So even the phrase of separate but unequal, separate but equal is unequal, right? So even that phrase in itself, when people are not, that doesn't mean integration. That didn't mean that we wanted to come and be in your school. That didn't mean that we wanted you to come and be in ours. That just means that we wanted equal resources to be able to continue to sustain, to educate our children. But the fact is that is always separated and taken out of a conversation. And people think that you're teaching social justice when you're talking about Martin Luther King's and the civil rights movement, but then the conversation centers around integration is extremely problematic. Extremely.
That's right. And we can't get at it in the classroom until we create curriculum that relieves us of, as teachers, that relieves us of the heavy lifting of having to have the exact conversation you just had over and over again. So, you know, as we know, as teachers, a key moment in the education process is asking better questions. If you don't ask better questions, it's difficult to get to better answers. And what you just laid out is very important. That's why when we wrote the curriculum in Philadelphia for the high school course, the curriculum framework for the mandatory African-American history high school course there. And parenthetically, let me say this very quickly. I was having a conversation with Sister Njamele last week. She was rereading one of the works out of Philadelphia, School District Philadelphia's curriculum office dating back to the early 70s. Where there was a commission that was chaired by Ed Robinson. John Henry Clark was on that commission, and they wrote curriculum framework. There have been African-American curriculum frameworks written in the School District of Philadelphia since the late 60s, since the students took over the protested in front of the school district building in 67. The problem with curriculum is once you've written it, if it's not implemented, it's as if you never did it. So I'm under no illusions. We work very hard on the Freedom Schools pathway curriculum. We work very hard on the framework high school curriculum. And the reason I'm bringing them up now is because those curricula exist. And one of the things we did is go back and look at as many of the other curriculum as possible to gain the momentum of memory. Why is that important in terms of what you just laid out, in terms of this question of integration, separation, segregation, all these words we throw about as if we understand them.
Right.
You know, in the Philadelphia high school curriculum, we developed 6 what we call conceptual categories. We said if in a curriculum framework, if you enter the high school classroom with these 6 categories of questions, we can then begin to answer those questions by getting content, by having conversation. And the answers to those questions will be better answers because we have taken the time to frame better questions. I won't go through all the categories. I'll go through the first 2 because they speak directly to what you just said. Our first challenge as educators, and we sat around one summer, all summer, shout out to Dana King, master educator, who at one time was the director of the School District of Philadelphia's Office of Social Studies, and also African-American Studies. And she was actually one of the first people as a teacher when she was at Ben Franklin High School and had been at Central High School and other places. She sent us our first wave, helped send us our first wave of Philadelphia Freedom School students in 1999. You had to have a teacher recommendation, and Dana was one of the master teachers, along with Aisha Amani and many others in the city. Anyway, we sat around for a summer trying to say, how can we come up with better questions? And how can we shrink it to a way where we can just bring it in the classroom, let these questions loose, and then fill it up with content, fill it up with inquiry? The first thing we had to do was disentangle what you just raised. In other words, every narrative of Black life in America becomes a footnote to white history.
Yes.
So that, so when Nancy Pelosi says last week, a week before, George Floyd sacrificed his life for America. No, George Floyd is not a footnote in white history, Nancy.
It's not.
With all due respect, people got mad. I said, don't get mad. As John Henry Clark, you say, don't get mad, get smart.
Yes.
So the reason she can do that is because we haven't created a framework of asking better questions. So we said, how do you separate out who Black people are to each other and who we are in the world from who we are to other people? So the first category we created was something called the social structure category. We said, wherever we're studying, have students ask this question: who are Black people in this moment we're studying? And it works for anybody, brown people, other people. Who are Black people to other people in this moment? So we take a moment and say, say the civil rights movement. Who are these Black people to America? Well, they are people trying to make a better America. They are people who value integration because somehow they think that being with white people will help diversity. And that's where we get all this foolish language that diversity will improve everything. Wait a minute. That's only one question. But now we've isolated it, separated it, and we should have a robust conversation about it. But now we get to the second of the 6 categories. And these are the 2 categories that shape everything. The second category is the governance category. We took that language from Jacob Carruthers, the great educator out of Chicago, who talks about governance. How do Black people create communities where we govern ourselves? And that governance question doesn't ask who Black people are to other people. That's the social structure question, and it's important. We should talk about it. The governance question asks, who are Black people to each other?
Yep.
And so let me give you a very specific example. So I'll give you just one quick example. Talk about social justice, right? 1957, the so-called Little Rock Nine, as we've talked about before, integrates Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. We talked about this one before. I'm just making the emphasis because y'all go back and look at the conversations me and Shana and I have had. In the social structure, it's these 9 heroic Black teenagers who are spit on, and the social, and the National Guard has to come out, just like that child, Ruby Bridges in Louisiana, with her little briefcase coming. That's the social structure. That's who she is to you. But when you ask the governance structure question, who are these people to each other? Then you find out you haven't even asked, who were Ruby Bridges' parents? And what did they think? Did you know Ruby Bridges' father did not want her to go integrate that school? He didn't want that pressure. He was a military veteran. They harassed him on his job. After she went over there, he got fired from his job. How do we know that? Ruby Bridges is still alive. She was a child then. She's an elder now. But we never even asked, because she's useful as like a pair of earrings to the American social structure question, but you never asked who she was to herself. And that Little Rock Nine, who are they to each other? Those young people came with some of the top students out of the segregated schools of Little Rock, Arkansas, which included Paul Lawrence Dunbar High School, which had closed the year before. And when they went to Central High School, you had, of the Little Rock Nine, you had student leaders, you had athletes, you had top scholars. They get to Central High School, and the white people start writing them up for disciplinary actions, harassing them. They can't be leaders in the student government. But we never asked who they were to each other. So when you're a young person in a classroom in 2021 and you never ask the governance question, the lesson you're getting in the classroom is you exist for a society that will always have you as a footnote in its history. So you can't even imagine yourself except in that context. And you lose the momentum of the fact that everything we have done starts with the governance question, and then tries to answer those other questions. We didn't march so that we could lose our identities. We marched to make sure we got the same resources everybody else got. And that's an important thing we should never lose sight of.
We did not march for your we shall overcome story. And that's
what
it turns into, right?
That's right.
Like,
that's what the social structure does. That's right.
Little Rock, Arkansas, not like all of those examples are to show, look what you did to overcome, right? Yeah.
Right.
You taught us something, and now the world is at harmony, at peace, which we all know is they're gonna lie, right?
And then we keep asking the question, and that's Shana, that's critical. That's critical, because when that becomes the narrative, when you don't take the time to build out a curriculum framework that asks better questions, then the answer to what you just raised transfers from the society, meaning state violence, meaning all these things are really the things that are keeping us from fulfilling our full human potential. And it brings it and puts it right back on us. So
Yep.
you marched, you sang, you did all that. And here it is, 2021. Wait, y'all grades ain't no higher? Wait, you still struggling? Okay, this is your fault.
It's you.
because you didn't. And George Floyd is a great example. What Derek Chauvin's lawyers were counting on was at least one juror who did not believe George Floyd was a human being.
Yep.
That's
who
because
thought this man was an old drug addict, right? Like
an old drug addict sitting on the hood of a Benz trying to pass off fake $20 bill. In other words,
yep.
You're not human. That's because and I'm saying that was the best strategy the defense had, and it can work. The only reason it didn't work in this instance is because you had all the video footage in the world. You had Maya Angelou and August Wilson could not have written a better script of witnesses to testify. You had the police chief, you had the police testifying against the police so that the police can keep being the police. In other words, the bad apple analogy, it is just a bad apple. But that lawyer still had us like, oh, we don't know. Because what do we learn in our classrooms? What do we learn in our societies? That Black people are not human. In other words, there's something, you have to be a perfect human being if you're Black to even be able to get in the classroom and get in the courtroom and say, I shouldn't be killed. But if you, if you smoke weed, if you got an opioid problem, if you trying to get your life together after you do, then Derek Chauvin had no choice but to sit on your knee. Why? Because look, he's in the jungle. All these non-human beings are yelling at him and stuff. What that lawyer was basically saying is Derek Chauvin is a human being in the jungle, policing the animals, and he had no choice. And that could have worked if one person on that jury had bought that. But all this evidence made it just about impossible. Had it not been, if there were no video, we wouldn't be talking about George Floyd. He'd just be another non-human killed in the streets. So people say, well, that's not true. Let us get the momentum of memory. Yep. Let us not forget that when Schwerner and Goodman and Cheney were killed in 1964 in Mississippi, and the FBI and them who were monitoring this stuff the whole time, when people went out to do a dragnet to find them, these two white young men had been killed with this brother. They found other bodies, and Black people in Mississippi said, we've been telling y'all for years they've been doing to us. But now that human beings have been killed, you're finding out what happens to us every day.
As soon as you finish talking, those exact three men popped into my head.
No question.
Freedom cannot rest until it comes, right?
No, in fact, I'm glad you said that because Snick wrote, I got a chance to talk to Matthew Jones about this. I mean, when Snick had the 50th anniversary at Shaw, when they wrote that song In the Mississippi River, those young people started naming the rivers, and they said, y'all came down here, and Bernice Johnson Reagan talks about this, who found the sweet honey in the rock. We who believe in freedom took the Ella Baker speech and made it into a song. Bernice Johnson Reagan, she says, out of Albany, Georgia, Bernice Johnson Reagan said, when they came down here looking for them, they found all those other bodies. And when we started singing In the Mississippi River, we said we can count them 1 by 1, count them 2 by 2. Count them 3 by 3, count them 4 by 4. Just that, with their heads cut off, with their hands tied behind their back. These are the Black people they murder every day, but you would never have known they were in the Tallahatchie River, in the Yazoo River, had it not been the fact that white people have been killed, which reinforces the fact white means human in this society, and the rest of us, we're people of color. Meaning what? Second-class citizens. When I hear people of color, what I hear is second-class citizens. That's a social structure phrase. Because if you're not calling white people of color, then what you said is white people are people, and the rest of y'all, you're people of color. I said, no. So take that phrase with all due respect. If you don't throw it in the trash, try this as a classroom exercise. Take the phrase people of color, put it on the board, and ask students who in here is not a person of color. And do that in an integrated classroom. It's going to be difficult, but that's why teachers need to be paid a lot more and have a lot better training, because ultimately teaching should be the most valued occupation in society.
In this country, without a doubt. Even when we're speaking about social justice, right? One of the things that I was pondering was coming on this conversation was like, is education a necessary part of social justice, or should I say that social justice is a necessary part of education? Right? Because people don't look at them as two frameworks that go together all the time. right? Like you
No.
go to school to be educated or to be indoctrinated, and social justice is something that should be happening outside of the classroom, unless you have this one righteous teacher, right, who's going to spark that and impact that. But I don't, in me thinking about like progression in America or how we should be in the world, I don't know if you should be separating the two.
Well, you can't. Social justice is a phrase that emerges out of the context of oppression.
That's right.
If it weren't for oppression, then you wouldn't need social justice.
That's right.
So ideally, social justice should be a temporary thing, even though we know there's never been such a thing as a perfect human society. Although in the last 500 years, social justice has been bound to the context of white nationalism, white supremacy, settler colonialism. So that becomes the threat to human life in the context we're talking about social justice now. Now, education, of course, is a much more fundamental, elemental thing.
Mhm.
Education exists regardless of any other social phenomena. What do I mean? And Asa Hilliard used to always say this: human beings are learning from the time they're conceived. So when your son was in your womb, he's learning how to eat.
Mhm.
He's learning how. I mean, he's learning when you had tacos. I don't like that. He's learning when you drink water. I like that. You know, the body, the organism, and then he comes out, and from the second he emerges out of your womb, he's watching. He's learning. He's taking, ooh, that's cold. Ooh, that's hot. Ooh, I'm hungry. He can't say I'm hungry yet. He can just say, ah.
He knows though, because he's been learning.
Right. And then he's listening to you talk and say, oh, got it. I'm hungry. In other words, I'm learning language. This is Noam Chomsky and them talking about. This is Betty Risby and the whole the test, the observations they made where they broke out families by income levels and said, okay, how many words do the people in this the children in this household hear? How many words do the people in this household hear? And then they start seeing, when you start breaking it down by what the parents have to do to survive, there are word gaps that turn from 100 words gaps into thousands, into 10,000s, into 50,000s, into millions of words over years. And then you wonder why a child comes in and says, when you hear somebody with mumble rap, that's somebody who doesn't have the same word options. And that doesn't mean it has nothing to do with intelligence. Nope. This has everything to do with what have you learned. So education is always taking place. What we have to do a better job of, it seems to me, and all of us, we've all been in this conversation, is distinguishing formal education from education writ large. Because the same child that says, I can't do math, will take you through a mathematical odyssey outside of the classroom in trying to problem solve what we might call problem-based learning in the classroom, something that she or he is interested in. Okay, you say you can't do math, but I just saw you work out in your head how you was going to make this money, flip this over here, do this, and get everything done. So by the end of the month, you had enough money for your prom dress, you had enough money from your job, and you flip that with what this piece of check. That's all math. Is it? Yeah. But you haven't applied it to the formal classroom, because somewhere in this process, we have begun to identify schooling, formal education, with something that is not for us or we don't want to participate in. And so social justice in education looks like, how do we structure formal education so that it enhances our ability to reach our full human potential and enter this society as full human beings who are going to extend the best of the society.
Yes. And when you say society, I want to just make this clear. I'm not saying not for overall society, but I think for Black people, it's really important for us to understand how we can benefit ourselves and our community, because I think a lot of which will benefit all in a sense.
That's the key. It will benefit all.
Benefit all. We are not trying to create a society in which you only think about you, because we know, like, African descent, like, we are about communalism. We are all about communalism. We are all about society helping and growing together.
That's right.
But I think that a lot of times when we say, like, how can you benefit society, folks think about opportunities that kind of expand overall. When we need things like, you should come back and be a teacher because young Black children need you. And if you're teaching young Black children, that is how you push and benefit society. So even this notion of us talking about social justice, one of the questions that I was looking forward to talking about today is, why is it necessary for Black teachers to be able to contextualize social justice in the classroom? Why do we need Black teachers to do that? Why is that point important and key?
Wow. Okay, well, let me start with this. Asa Hill used to say this all the time, and in fact, there's a very good book that we read this in Freedom Schools many years ago as well, called "Young, Gifted, and Black." And when I say we read this in Freedom Schools, for folks who don't know, what we do in Freedom Schools, it isn't just educators reading; it's the children reading. And at one point, particularly when we had the Pathways curriculum running real well, the things that the educators, the teachers were reading, and the thing that our high school students and college students were reading were being then translated into curriculum that they were teaching and learning alongside the young people, the 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12-year olds. So all this works as a seamless whole. So Asa Hilliard used to say, teachers should have content mastery. So you should know your subject matter. So folks in teacher education programs, or you in math education and can't do math, ask yourself, why am I in a program teaching me technique, but I didn't learn the math? So you gotta have content mastery. Also have to have style and technique. So have to have that ability, that capacity. People talk about developing educators, and you all do it as well or better than anybody. And then the ability to gain the experience to be able to relate to students. Now, we all know, and if we don't know, certainly there's a ream of research, and there's constantly more being done. I'm just reading a study that came out of the University of North Carolina on, I love how everybody's now trying to brand their scholarship. So, the lead was EDGE, the power of a Black teacher, right? Yes. So, it's a question of edge. I put edge in the category as a word with grit and all these other things. It's just labels, okay? We set that aside, get the momentum of memory. Go back to those educators who we valued and look at the ones that you valued growing up. Ask what they did. You can label it or not, but don't get caught up in labels. But my point is that we all know that there's a ream of research and more scholarship coming out to talk about the effectiveness of having Black teachers in classrooms, what it does for classroom management, what it does for student performance, all these kind of things. Okay, so why though that's the case? I love how people, in fact, one of my Jegnas, the great Anderson Thompson ancestor, used to call it death watch studies. He said, we study things we already know, but then we present it to other people as if it's a revelation. And then they then take it, fund themselves to study us while we're still being killed. So people say, well, how do we educate Black children? Well, we've done this research and we've seen that a Black teacher, okay, that's very nice. Now, this is from the University of North Carolina, right? Yeah. Okay. Is that the same North Carolina where they just murdered a man in cold blood? Yeah. So while they still killing us, we researching what will help us. No, go understand what the Black teachers did. Black teachers, and we model this a lot in the classrooms, Freedom School classrooms, we would always do this. I'll give you some very concrete examples. Every time we would gather, and all the high school students would come together once a week, we'd all be together. And we still do that, of course. Now, the first thing we would do is read selections from various newspapers together. And so now the digital age, that might look a little different, but why do we do that? Because one way we teach social justice is to help students understand what's going on in the world. So not just what's going on their block, not just what's going on in their lives, but the fact that, for example, almost close to 400,000 people were reported as contracting COVID in the last 24 hours in India. This should be a story that we're all aware of, right? Why, as we're talking about, well, should we open schools? Did you get the shot? Did you get your second shot? Okay, India is melting. And we live in a world where COVID doesn't recognize national boundaries and the airplanes are coming and going. Understand, until we reach a certain level globally, nobody is safe. So and then we turn to another story and find out, well, what's going on in Africa? What's going on in Chad? They had a coup d'etat. Yeah, what happened? Well, the military, what is France's position? What's the United States position? So instead of just saying, oh, Joe Biden gave a talk last night and we're looking at this relief and we're going to get some checks and some tax credits, which, by the way, when you read the newspaper, you understand that if we do that every day, we're doing two things. One, we're modeling what our parents did with us and our grandparents did with us. Number two, we're passing on to young people the fact that you should know what's going on. You shouldn't rely on a couple of tweets or a hashtag. But social justice then means that once you start with that awareness, you then set yourself to the work of the classroom that day, with students now having been opened up to being human in the world. And so whatever topic we're talking about, they can begin to relate to the challenges that are facing human beings other places, and they can see the similarities and they can see the differences and they can see how they connect. So when a student, for example, and we did this last summer, of course, as we know, when we were at the center, we had Liberation Academy and Freedom School. When those students started doing what we would call in the academy applied research. In other words, let's look up the statistics. Let's look up the data. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Let us take this moment and find out what we can do to free ourselves. We invited policymakers like the Freedom School alum, the great Isaiah Thomas, Councilman Thomas there, and he brought his colleagues in from Philadelphia City Council. Young people doing applied research can now see, wait a minute, this is happening in Philly, but this is happening in Texas. Wait, this is happening in New York. Wait, this is happening in Alabama. Wait, oh, now I see how this connects to California. So when somebody says defund the police, pause. Social justice? Yes. Let us now unpack that and see what that means. We just did some research and we see that this money went to extra equipment and more guns, and you could have taken that same money and put it into social workers and put it in EMS, and you could have avoided all. But that's because they're asking different questions, because they've done some research, they're comparing, they're aware of themselves in the world, and they see how the local becomes the national, becomes the global, and all of that then animates something. And then finally, somebody coming in with a pad talking about they're going to take notes because they're going to improve curriculum. Now they're not teachers now. They basically created an industry where they engaged in what Anderson Thompson calls death watch studies. They peeking in, they write, and they publish in a journal. Yes, and one way that you can improve. Okay, that's cool. But guess what? You're going to put the label social justice on that. You know what we call it? We call it education. That's what we call it. We don't even need the phrase social justice except as a tactical phrase to use in specific context to organize. But our lives should not be organized around social justice, because that diminishes our objective, which is to live fully in the world and take our memory and pass it on to the next generation on how to do that. We are not here to save the world. We save the world by saving ourselves.
That's right. That's big, right? And I don't think people understand that, because so much Black history and movement is around social justice, or that's what people make it to be, right? Because our history
social category, yes. Who are we to other people? We're the sacrificial lambs. We're the angels. We're the people who don't mind jumping down there and getting bit by that dog. We're the people, in other words, in the words of Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, we go from cotton to Congress. No, bruh. No. We went from the origins of humanity to an L that we refused to take back to what we were doing before we so rudely interrupted. But if you start your history in the cotton field, Brother Tim, then I understand why you say that America is not a racist country, because you were severely miseducated, bro. Severely miseducated. You could have benefited from the curriculum we're talking about now. I'm not mad at him. I'm mad at his teachers.
As teachers, I say that all the time. Who taught you? Who raised you?
Man? Who raised you, bro?
Who raised you that you are in the world speaking like this?
And he didn't get to. I mean, when I talk about the fact we read the newspaper every day, part of the reason we read in my classrooms because my daddy read the newspaper every day. We saw Tim Scott get on TV last night and say his granddaddy sat there every night, and he didn't realize until he was grown that his granddaddy who had that newspaper open could not read. But guess what? Your grandfather, who may not have been able to read, he had that newspaper open. And clearly you didn't get the message. Why? Because you can read and lied about the voter disenfranchisement bill in Georgia, which means your grandfather was showing you, he was educating you, even though he couldn't read. Ben Carson's mom did the same thing. Y'all write these book reports. They didn't know till later she couldn't read them, but that ain't the point. These are educators. Now, something broke down between that mother, Ben Carson's mom, and Tim Scott's grandfather and them. What broke down?
The schools they went to.
Exactly.
The schools they went to. And that's a whole, we could do a whole nother show on that. Or how
this is why y'all exist, right?
Yes. We could do another show on that, because parents are so trusting of the American indoctrination.
Come on.
You are sending your kid there, and these folks are, I need to find a better word for it, but they're brainwashing your kids. So sometimes I say, like, there's nobody else better to brainwash my own kids than me, okay? Because they know I'm going to be teaching my kids some stuff to benefit their culture, when I'm going to teach my kids the things that they need to know about themselves, about this history, and about a movement, and everything you've been saying about memory and how to be and seek your own happiness and your own freedom in the world, and not keep trying to be somebody's sacrificial lamb, right?
That's right. Learn the momentum. Learn from the momentum of memory. We read Carr G. Woodson's Miseducation of the Negro.
Yes, we did.
Woodson's uncles taught Woodson and his brothers and sisters how to read and write because they had learned when they were veterans of the Civil War. Woodson's mother and father could not read or write, James and Eliza, but they made sure all of their children could. And the main way they did is because her brothers who had been in the Civil War were their first teachers. Learn the momentum of memory. In fact, you ain't got to go back to the 18, I would have been the 1880s and 90s for Woodson.
Mm-hmm.
Go in your house, ask the elders in your house, how did their elders value education? To me, one of the most important things we can do for social justice work in classrooms is have our young people sit with their elders and ask them. The first question they should ask is, one of the first questions is, when you were a little girl, when you were a little boy, what was education like? And then just sit back and listen. Let those children find out the momentum of memory is in their house. Mm-hmm. That's so very important.
Momentum of memory and ways of being.
And ways of being. That's right.
And then because we're coming up on time, but I think it's important for people to watch, who are watching, to hear this. We have current educators who support the show.
Of course.
If I'm a teacher right now in the classroom, right, and we are talking about social justice, what should I be talking about to my students for the next 6 months? Like, what conversation should I be having and centering in my classroom if I say that I want to highlight or lift up social justice in my classroom?
Well, I think, again, just very quickly, applying the momentum of memory model and work we've done. And this isn't just us in Philly. I mean, it's all over it. And that's one of the beautiful things. In fact, the book we're doing this summer, We Are an African People, talking about those African-centered schools in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. This is the work that we can all do. It requires us looking, number one, bring what's going on in the world into the classroom, regardless of subject matter. If you have to carve out 5 minutes or 5 to 7 minutes to do a current events, it was the reason that people did current events in school. They were trying to build a national identity. We're trying to build out a Black community, a remembering of who we are. So look at current events. That should include something global. This is more work for teachers. Tie it to something that has happened in the past so that we get that momentum of memory. And then look for resources. There's so many resources. Our friends at Teaching for Change, there have been a couple of good volumes put out. There's one called Teaching for Black Lives. There's another one called Black Lives Matter at School. There's a lot of work. There's a lot of resources. I mean, through the center, through the portal, Center for Black Educated Development, and connecting to all of our partners, you can see people around the country. Because one of the things that we do, but we should always try to do more of, is talk to each other. Educators are, I don't stop short of it. I'll say it in this context. Educators are a sacred group. To be an educator is there's no more important element. In fact, everybody got a teacher. We always say that everybody had a teacher. Everybody has a teacher.
Yeah.
Talk to other teachers. This is one thing I love about the Teaching for Change. They build networks of teachers. So you trading lesson plans, you're trading curriculum, you get together regularly, what you're doing every Thursday. This is an opportunity for teachers to have conversation. And then as teachers become aware of other teachers, you build community, and then you trade lesson plans. There's no one size fits all. There's only the same determination to be free. So I think in your classroom, do those current events, tied to something historical, momentum of memory, and try then to find resources that will help you do both those things. And I think you'll then talk to each other, and we continue this conversation, and you'll figure out what works, what doesn't work. And then talking to other people, that's how we build. That's how we built every piece of curriculum I've ever worked on. Wasn't developed in isolation
by yourself. It was a group, it was a community, a meeting of minds. Nobody's smarter than anybody. We all have something to contribute. And many of those plans, especially as time went on, were created in intergenerational spaces where high school students had input, college students had input. It was all these meetings of the mind and community working together to create that curriculum.
That's right. And I should say that when you do that kind of work, that's right, Shannon. And when you do that kind of work, do not throw it away, because what this system relies on is short-circuiting the momentum of our memory. In other words, every time we start a new initiative, we start from ground zero. Meanwhile, what happens in oppressive systems, they never forget. They would never allow their children to start from ground zero. But every time we want to do something, we need to write a curriculum. Hold on. We did. Do you? Now we starting from ground zero, facing state violence. The momentum of memory is used against us, and we won't even remember. Hey, y'all remember when we won that fight? Wait, we won? Wait, we fought?
Win.
We win, right? Wait, we won? Yes, y'all won. You know what I'm saying? But then here's the other thing I'll say very quickly about this in 15 seconds. It's one thing to have the momentum of memory short-circuited. That's the big problem. Then when people then come in and say, I'm gonna help you, and then give you another, wait a minute. No. Let me tell y'all right now, diversity is a social structure question. The answer to the diversity question in the United States of America is, how can we improve whiteness? In other words, how can we add a few more people who are not part? That's how you get Nancy Pelosi saying George Floyd gave his life for America, because George Floyd, in other words, diversifying social justice in America. No. Tim Scott is diversity. That's the diversity question. How do we blacken up the thing we were going to do already? That's very different than liberation work. Liberation work is we're going to be human in the world collectively, and anybody trying to stop us, we're going to remake the society we live in until we can be free. And guess what? If you drop that whiteness, you can be free too. But you're going to have to drop that whiteness, because that's a much more dangerous gun.
You have to let it go. You have to let it go. And I'm so happy you made that distinction between diversity and what liberation work is, or the new, kind of like hot phrases to be anti-racist, right? But not understanding the distinction between liberation and freedom and what that means for all people.
That's right,
brother. That would be a whole nother show that we and we coming up on time. But I think you just gave me a good idea to bring you back for another show to talk about liberation work versus diversity and anti-racism. Because I think that in a lot of education spaces, those are the topics and the trainings that folks are receiving. But is that really helping you to like support and again contextualize social justice for Black children? I say no.
No, it's not.
One last thing, because I know we got some avid readers on here, and I always think this is important because you always ground us in intellectual work. I'm a person trying to ground myself in social justice and really be better for my kid. Can you really spit out 5 books right now that would be good for folks to start and read? 5 books.
Let's not go too far afield. Let's keep it nice, cheap, and accessible. Get Carter G. Woodson's 1933, The Miseducation of the Negro. Absolutely. There are a number of very good books that have been written fairly recently. You want a good survey history of Africa. And you can leave it up to whoever you want to do. In fact, if you go to the UN, the United Nations General History of Africa, that's accessible. All 8 volumes are available on the UN website. Now, I wouldn't recommend you start with those, but just know those are a resource. Get a good history of African people here in America. And I could look at any number of books, but you know what? I'll give you a couple that I think are good, that are also very cheap and accessible. If you want to talk about, for example, women in the history of women of African descent in Africa, this book just came out. This is Nwando Achebe's book, Female Monarchs and Merchant Queens in Africa. It's a recent book, but this is from the Ohio University Short History of Africa series. There are a lot of good little books like that out. In fact, if you get, let me look here and see. You got me thinking about it now. I got so many different books to use. Okay, all right. I'll keep it short. I'll keep this another 10 seconds. Aikwe Armah, Armah. Get his book, The Eloquence of the Scribes. I always recommend that. We did that in Freedom School when it first came out. Baba Aikwe is still alive. He's in Senegal, but that book gives a good framework. I'm thinking about framework books. And then finally, one of my all-time favorites, just to get a sense of how Black people walk through the world over the last century plus. Ida B. Wales, get her book, Crusader Without Violence. The autobiography, it's called The Autobiography of Ida B. Wales. There are a lot of great books been written about her, but whenever somebody has told you their life, you should consult that. Get Ida B. Wales' book. Ida B. Wales' book is a good place to look at how a woman of African descent navigated the late 19th, early 20th century and fought back using intellectual work as her weapon, using her pen as the weapon.
Oh, Baba, thank you so much. I think that was so helpful. So I want to give you, of course, a chance to close out with a final word before I close out. But of course, I just want to thank you personally always for coming and being a part of the conversation. And you just mean so much to me, and I appreciate you.
No, listen, I appreciate you too. I appreciate you too, Shane. In fact, that'll be my closing word. Not only do I appreciate you and everything that you do, I appreciate the team there at the center with Bobby Elmecki. Again, I appreciate Citizen Ed with Josh and Noor and all the folks who are here. I appreciate all those educators, my dear friend Erica Asakoye. Now she rolling with y'all. So Anshere and Nadir and all y'all. I appreciate every educator I've learned from and continue to learn from. And for educators out there, do not fetishize Black death. Do not reinforce in our children a sense of helplessness or inevitability, like this is just the way it is, which means we all have to engage in deep self-examination. Is what I'm doing in this moment in the classroom something that is feeding into this sense of hopelessness? Or am I indeed looking at these young people and they're looking at me and we're in community and I'm helping them see that being human in the world is the ultimate objective of education? And we've got a lot of models in our memory if we can just use that momentum. So thank you, sis. You know, I love you very, very much. I can't wait for the next time. I'll be watching on Thursday, so I can't be waiting for the next time we in conversation. So, and y'all watch this show. Noon Thursday. It's a wrap. Just shut it down for an hour and watch this show.
So as always, I want to thank all of you for coming out and supporting Building the Black Educator Pipeline. We appreciate you. You can always visit us at the center, www.thecenterblack.org. So check us out. We are still open for applications for Freedom Schools nationally for our scholars. We will be beginning to hire our high school and our college students within the next 2 weeks. And always, I want to give a major shout out to the funders who are courageous and revolutionary enough to invest in this work to keep this going. But appreciate all my co-conspirators out there. Please like, please share, please comment. So until next time, I'll see you guys next week.